Hi everyone, it's Katrina. Imagine a world hidden beneath the surface, a world of ancient civilizations and lost secrets, a world that's been waiting for us to uncover it. But what if the most mind-blowing discoveries are happening right now? In this video, we are diving deep into the latest archaeological finds that are rewriting history. Sunken secrets of prehistoric humans, the only suit of Roman armor ever found, and the truth behind the scariest mummy in the world. Let's get into it. Saving the cave. You are not going to believe this underwater cave in France. Humans used to actually live here. It's underwater now and has been that way for thousands of years. You can only enter the cavern by diving to its entrance about 120 feet beneath the surface. How the ancient people got into the cave was a little easier. They didn't require the complex diving equipment that modern archaeologists need for investigating the famous Cosquer Cave, because during the glacial Pleistocene era, 33,000 years ago, the entrance to the cavern was 330 feet above sea level. Archaeologist Michel Olive said the cave used to be 6.2 miles from the coast. It was occupied at a time when the global sea level was 443 feet lower than it is today. Just try to imagine all that fantastic waterfront property. Climate change caused the sea levels to rise, flooding the cavern. It is now the only place in the world with prehistoric underwater marine art. That is quite an accomplishment. But the artwork isn't going to be around forever. Scientists are in a race against Mother Nature to save the marine art from our modern climate change conundrum. In 2011 alone, the water level of Cosquer Cave rose 5 inches. Global sea levels rise a few millimeters each year, and the water is getting closer and closer to the ancient paintings. Check out this picture courtesy of Jespa. On the left is the location of the cave. You can't see it because it's underwater, but that's what it looks like at the surface. The right side is the diagram showing how the water has flowed into the cave over the centuries. Because parts of the cave are higher than sea level, they remain dry, and that is where the art is. It was plastered on the walls by prehistoric people up until about 18,000 years ago. The French cave was discovered by Henri Cosquer in 1985, and what followed was a deadly disaster. In the 6 years before the discovery was announced to the public, dozens of divers and amateur adventurers risked their lives trying to get inside of it. These were people in the know. They knew about the discovery by word of mouth. And 3 divers died trying to see the ancient art. On September 1st, 1991, the trio of divers from Grenoble couldn't find the exit and ran out of oxygen. Henri Cosquer helped recover the bodies. 2 days later, Henri finally, after 6 years, revealed the cave to French authorities. It was such a bombshell discovery that people didn't believe it was real. French prehistorians like Brigitte Deluc and Denis Vialou doubted the cave's authenticity. There are 229 rock art figures on the walls. Think about how much has been lost considering 4/5 of the cave is already underwater. The art figures represent 13 different species of creatures. There are also 69 red and black handprints, some made by children, and some look like they were made by E.T. What's really interesting is that archaeologists have found that people most likely didn't live in the cave. They haven't found any evidence of a permanent habitation. It seems that people only went into Cosquer Cave to make paintings. It was an art studio. But why? What attracted our ancestors to dark caves to express their artistic creativity? Although you can't see the cave now with your own eyes, in 2022, a life-sized replica opened in the town of Marseille. If you want to see the hundreds of geometric signs, depictions of human body parts, and prehistoric monsters drawn on the cave's walls, this cave should definitely be on your bucket list. And now for number 8, but first, it's shoutout time! I want to give a big thank you to MK Semposki and hubby, as well as Coco and Dad! Thanks so much for letting us be a part of your day. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about recent archaeological discoveries. Stone Circle in Mexico. A very mysterious ruin has been found in the Mexican village of Tecacahuaco. You may not have heard of the village before, seeing as it's such a small place in Hidalgo, populated mostly by farmers. But this sleepy town is hiding ancient secrets. It was a farmer exploring his land who stumbled upon the ruin. It's an unusual circular structure made from stone, but you can't really tell what it is just by looking at it. The farmer found the structure partially eaten by vegetation, broken and in bad shape. It looks like somebody dropped a bomb on it, but it clearly has some historical significance. In a small community like Tecacawako with only around 1,200 people in it, word spreads fast. It didn't take long before other farmers and local villagers were hanging out on the farmer's property to look at the discovery. Then the story started circulating. Suddenly, there were rumors that the structure was considered sacred by ancient healers. The villagers are now claiming that healers would bring their sick patients to the site and perform ceremonies. They would leave offerings to appease the gods, hoping their sacrifices would help the sick to recover faster. There's another rumor that's begun to circulate as well, this one a little more nefarious. A local priest allegedly found other stone monuments in the area a few years ago. The priest ordered them to be destroyed to cover up the truth of the ancient site. This was what the Spanish did when they first invaded the lands of Mexico. They destroyed temples and other holy sites and used the stones to build churches over them. It's hard to believe such a practice is still being carried out by priests in this day and age. It did take a while, but eventually word of the discovery reached archaeologists at Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History. They dispatched a team of researchers to examine the stone monument, and those researchers just released their initial findings. The structure is made of mud plaster bricks. It's about 12 feet tall, with its exterior featuring an intact stone staircase. Ancient people who visited the site would have been able to easily climb to its peak. But what did they do up there? Archaeologists found evidence that the structure was originally encased inside a much larger structure. Picture a squat tower sheltered by a much larger tower, like a Russian nesting doll, only for buildings. It's a surprising mystery because archaeologists can't date the structure and they can't figure out what it is. The ruins of the larger structure are all gone, so that's a dead end. They did find some fragments of obsidian, which was used by Mesoamericans to make tools, but other than that, the experts are stumped. What do you think this structure was used for? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The Screaming Mummy Mystery. The mystery behind one of the most terrifying mummies ever discovered could finally be solved. Archaeologists think the Screaming Mummy may have literally died screaming. I have to warn you, the tale I'm about to tell you will chill you to your core. It all began in 1935 with an archaeological expedition to Deir el-Bahari near Luxor. Archaeologists came across the mummified remains of a woman with her mouth wide open. Even though she had been dead for 3,500 years, you can still hear her shrieking just by looking at her. Some people have compared the Screaming Mummy to the famous painting by Edvard Munch, The Scream. You have to admit, the similarities are uncanny. The Screaming Mummy wasn't found alone. She was buried inside a wooden coffin underneath the tomb of Senmut, buried with Senmut's mother. But wait a minute, who was Senmut? His name translates into English as brother of mother. Now that's a little weird. Senmut was a famous architect during the reign of Pharaoh Hatshepsut, who herself was one of the most successful female rulers in human history. Senmut's architectural claim to fame was the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, which still stands all these years later. The Screaming Mummy was found buried in Senmut's mother's burial chamber. The weird thing is that archaeologists never found any records of the Screaming Mummy in Senmut's mom's tomb. It's assumed she was a close family friend. According to Dr. Sahar Salim from Cairo University, the Screaming Mummy was most likely allowed to share the family's eternal resting place. Ever since the 1930s, there has been speculation over why the mummy has her mouth opened in a soundless scream. But nobody ever thought she truly died in agony. Scientists figured her mouth had been stretched open after death due to some natural process, or maybe someone had accidentally opened it and it got stuck that way. Now it looks like some agony was indeed involved. Judging by her expression, a lot of agony. Dr. Salim and her colleagues recently used computerized tomography scanning technology to dissect the mummy virtually. They also used an exciting new technique called X-ray diffraction analysis, which reveals information about the skin and hair. Here are the results of the tests. The screaming mummy stood around 5 feet tall when she was alive. She suffered from a bad case of arthritis in her spine before she died around the age of 48. Researchers couldn't find any sign of an embalming incision, which makes sense because all of her organs were still inside her body. Dr. Salim said the presence of organs was a big surprise. During the New Kingdom of Egypt, between 1550 and 1069 BC, mummies had their organs removed, well, all of their organs except the heart. The only exception was for the less financially fortunate. If people couldn't afford the best embalmers, they sometimes couldn't afford to get all of their organs removed from their loved ones' corpses. The screaming woman wasn't poor, though. She was found decked out in scarab rings of silver and gold. Researchers found traces of resin and frankincense in her hair, which were imported from far away. She was also wearing a wig made from braided date palm fibers. Wigs may have been more fashionable in ancient Egypt than they are today. Certain chemicals were added to the wigs to make a woman's hair look blacker and more youthful. But enough about wigs, you're here for the screaming. Dr. Salim said the reason for the screaming mummy's open mouth could be due to an extraordinarily painful death. The woman may have suffered high emotional stress or an intense burst of pain at her exact moment of passing. Whatever it was, the trauma was bad enough that her mouth got frozen open in a rare form of rigor mortis. The embalmers couldn't even get it closed when they began her burial rites. Maybe they were so freaked out that they didn't bother extracting her organs. They just wanted her buried and out of their workshop. And so her mouth has remained open in an expression of her last painful moment of life for more than 3 millennia. And now she's being poked at by scientists. A Neanderthal Recipe. I'm going to give you a recipe that you won't find on Google. Well, maybe now you can. But I can guarantee it wasn't a recipe your grandmother knew or her grandmother. It was a recipe that was recently replicated by scientists who cooked up a Neanderthal meal. This is what Neanderthals were eating back when they still existed. Neanderthals lived in Europe until about 40,000 years ago. Then they went extinct for reasons not altogether known. Some think they were annihilated by us, aka Homo sapiens. Others believe they bred with ancient Homo sapiens, gradually becoming absorbed by us. They were assimilated. At several Neanderthal sites in Europe, archaeologists have found the remains of hearths. These weren't big fancy fireplaces like you might find in a Viking longhouse. They were primitive pits used for staying warm and cooking. At one such site in Portugal from 90,000 years ago, scientists found the remains of birds. Dr. Mariana Nabais from the Catalan Institute of Human Paleoecology and Social Evolution wanted to understand the bird remains better. To do this, she would recreate a Neanderthal meal in a way that most researchers wouldn't even think of. Mariana went to a local Portuguese wildlife rehabilitation center and collected 5 birds that had died there. She selected birds that were similar in size and species to the ones found at Neanderthal hearths. 2 of them were carrion crows, scientific name Corvus coronae. Another was a common wood pigeon, then 2 Eurasian collared doves. The next step was to prepare the birds using the same culinary instruments as our ancient friends, the Neanderthals. Mariana and her team used flint flakes, which were prepared for them by other scientists. The first step to recreating the Neanderthal recipe is to de-feather the birds by hand, then butcher them using the flint flake. Next, roast the birds over hot coals until cooked. In total, this recipe takes about 10 minutes to pull off. I warn you now, it's pretty bland. It's also dirty work. But this is how Neanderthals ate their food. I'm going to give you a bonus recipe today. In 2022, scientists discovered Neanderthal flatbread at the Shanidar cave site in Iraq. Neanderthals were living in the caverns 70,000 years ago. The flatbread proved that Neanderthals didn't just cook burrs and eat berries. They combined nuts and seeds with pulses to cook an actual flatbread. This was the bombshell discovery that revealed Neanderthals to secretly be culinary experts. Do you want to try Neanderthal flatbread? Let me know in the comments. The Roman cult. In Italy, you just never know what you're going to find under a parking lot. Most recently, it turned out to be a pagan temple. The discovery of this ancient sanctuary is shedding some light on a weird period in Roman history. The parking lot in question is located in a tiny town just north of Rome called Spello. During last summer's excavations, Douglas Boyne from St. Louis University dug up the parking lot with his team. They found 3 walls of a broken monumental structure that stood 1,600 years ago. You're never going to guess who the sanctuary was for. It was a temple, the kind you would expect gods to be worshipped. But this one didn't have anything to do with the gods. It was dedicated to the ancestors of Roman emperors. Worshipping emperors was a real thing. Have you ever heard of a dictator wanting to be treated like a god by their subjects? The Roman emperors were just like that. They wanted to be immortalized as deities. Why do you think they built so many crazy big statues of themselves? 1,600 years ago places the temple firmly in the reign of Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. I've talked about Constantine a lot on the channel, but for good reason. He was one of the most influential figures in Roman history. He adopted Christianity as the official religion of the empire. Without him, the Vatican might not even exist. The transitional period from pagans to Christians was a little messy, especially when there were so many false idols around. Even though Constantine adopted Christianity, this newly found temple was built in honor of him and his ancestors. It wasn't exactly Bible-friendly. You might be wondering what convinced an archaeologist from St. Louis University to dig up a parking lot in a small Italian town. Douglas was drawn to the town when he learned of a letter written by Constantine to the people who lived in Spello. The letter was Constantine granting the people of the town permission to celebrate a religious festival in honor of the Roman emperor's ancient family. They wanted to celebrate in their own town instead of journeying to a nearby city where there was an imperial temple. Constantine told them they could celebrate at home, but only if they built a temple dedicated to Constantine and his imperial ancestors. Roman gods like Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva were on the outs. Christianity was in, and so was the imperial cult. This was one of the strangest times in Roman history, when Constantine had his own temples and Jesus had his own churches. The Great Inca Earthquake. Scientists recently conducted a major scientific study in Peru to look at the construction techniques of Machu Picchu. They found that in 1450 AD, the city was struck by a powerful earthquake, one so powerful that it changed Inca society. Scientists think the Inca learned from the disaster. The builders of Machu Picchu switched up their methodology after the quake and started creating earthquake-proof buildings. If this is true, it means a natural disaster inspired one of the greatest technological advancements of ancient engineering. Inca craftsmanship is always exciting and impressive. Even the Romans couldn't contend with the cyclopean walls of Peru's greatest sites. I wonder who would have won in a building competition, the Romans or the Inca? What do you think? 1450 was a good year for the rest of the world. Johann Gutenberg had just started operating the first mechanical printing press. Someone somewhere had just finished writing the mysterious Voynich manuscript. But in Peru, 1450 was not a good year at all. The mountains shook so violently that the walls of their buildings fell over. Humpty Dumpty was knocked right off the wall. The quake was at least 6.5 on the Richter scale. Carlos Escobar was the scientist who coordinated the recent study. Escobar told reporters that when the earthquake struck, Machu Picchu was in the middle of construction. Then construction shifted. Emperor Pachacutec must have ordered a change in the way things were done. But how do scientists know any of this? It's because certain buildings show obvious evidence of the damage. For example, Machu Picchu's Temple of the Sun has some rocks broken on its edges. There was clearly an undulation of the earth, which caused the rocks and stones to form openings. But in other places, the temple is earthquake-proof. Suddenly, the masonry changed in a very clever way. The Inca began using larger stones at the bottom, with their walls narrower at the top. They knew exactly how to change their buildings so that they wouldn't fall down or break when the next earthquake came. There's no doubt about the change, but there is a lot of speculation surrounding the why and the how. If the Inca already knew how to create earthquake-proof buildings, why didn't they start with that technique? Why did they wait for an earthquake? And how did they even know which engineering method would produce the most stable buildings? Machu Picchu is practically indestructible in the face of a seismic event. Even by today's standards, it's pretty impressive. The Forgotten Goddess of War. When I say God of War, what's the first name to come to mind? And don't say Kratos. You're probably thinking about Ares, the Greek god of war. But are you familiar with Minerva, the Roman goddess of war? Yair Whitson from Haifa is a 13-year-old boy who became an unwitting archaeologist in 2024, so earlier this year. He went for a walk with his father and found a ring. I wish I could say it was the one ring to rule them all, but he wasn't that lucky. Yair looked down at the ground and there it was, a bronze ring engraved with the image of a warrior woman. It dates to around the 2nd century AD. I think for most of us, the best treasures we ever find on our walks are a few dusty old pennies. Yair found an 1,800-year-old bronze ring engraved with the image of the goddess of war. The amazing discovery took place near the Shalala ruins in Carmel, Israel, so it wasn't as if the kid found the relic walking through rural New Jersey, but it's still a very fortunate find. Recognizing the importance of the object, Yair's family got in touch with the Israel Antiquities Authority. They took the ring for inspection. A group of researchers confirmed that the figure on the ring is indeed Minerva. She is pictured in the nude, wearing a metal helmet and holding a shield and spear. You haven't seen a more fierce warrioress than this, even if she is only the size of a pea on the back of a ring. Someone wore this piece of jewelry proudly thousands of years ago when Israel was dominated by Rome. Researchers think it was a female who wore it as a sign of her courage, or perhaps her prowess as a warrior or a strategist. The Shalala ruins are complete with a Roman mansion, an ancient rock quarry, and a pair of burials. Whoever owned the ring likely lived at the mansion and was ultra-wealthy. As for Minerva, she was the Roman version of Athena. And this is where things get a little bit complicated. Ares and Athena were both Olympians, gods of Mount Olympus. They were also siblings. Different moms, but their father was Zeus. Ares was the son of Hera, while Athena was the daughter of Metis. Athena was deeply beloved by the ancient Greeks. I mean, they did name their greatest city after her. Perhaps you've heard of it. It's called Athens. She was known for her diplomacy, her strategies, and her calmness in the face of danger. And while Ares was the specific god of war, Athena was also associated with wartime. She was more of a strategist though, with her brother Ares being famous for his hot temper, bloodlust, and brutish savagery on the field of battle. In fact, people didn't really like Ares in ancient Greece. He resolved disputes through violence instead of compromise. Even though he was one of the 12 high Olympians, he was poorly regarded in human society. Ares was also largely unsuccessful in his battles. He was known for bringing calamity to humanity whenever he got involved. This was why Athena, with her clever strategies, was venerated more often as a war goddess. The lost relics of the Blackfoot tribe. An archaeological excavation at a Canadian stone circle has revealed some amazing artifacts from long before Europeans ever set foot in North America. You don't hear about that many archaeological digs in Canada, so this recent expedition is a big deal. The excavation was done next to a boring gravel footpath in a Calgary park. It isn't the type of place you expect to see archaeology students hunched over their notepads and resting on their shovels. It also isn't the kind of place you expect to see a stone circle. Keep in mind, this is no Stonehenge. There are no towering megaliths. Up until recently, only parts of the circle were visible, and people didn't even know what they were. People walked by, cut a shortcut straight through the stone circle, and didn't even realize they were walking over an ancient site that belonged to the Blackfoot people. Now, the University of Calgary is determined to find out more about the ancient site. History is hidden right under the soil, just feet away from where people walk their dogs and go jogging. Right now, researchers think the stone circle is a remnant of a Blackfoot camp. Centuries ago, a lodge would have stood here. There wouldn't have been any joggers, but likely a small settlement of semi-nomadic indigenous people. And it wasn't the only one in the park. Lindsay Amundsen Meyer from the University of Calgary said there are about 12 stone circles in the area. Unfortunately, not much remains of the stone circles except for a few stubby rocks sticking out of the grass, and the history behind them is largely forgotten. The team of scientists have found some artifacts, mostly scraps from stone tools, some seashells, and materials for making beads and decorations. Nobody knows how old anything at the site is, though it could be seriously ancient. For comparison, the nearby Hawkwood site has revealed evidence of activity from between 8,250 and 500 years ago. That should give you a small idea of how long the Blackfoot people and their ancestors used this land before it was taken from them. The oldest forest in the world. If you had to guess where you thought the oldest forest in the world is, where would you say? Maybe somewhere in the jungles of Southeast Asia? A hidden chunk of the Amazon? If you guessed either of those, you would be wrong. The world's oldest forest is only a 2-hour drive from one of the loudest and most rambunctious cities in the world, New York City. The oldest known forest in the world was found at the bottom of a quarry in Cairo, New York, not far from the Catskill Mountains. Scientists have known about the ancient forest for a long time, but they never knew precisely how old it was. Not until recently. Now, a study headed by Christopher Berry at Cardiff University has shocked everyone. Christopher told the BBC that the forest is older than the Amazon. It dates to prehistory and would have originally been spread across New York all the way to Pennsylvania. The root systems have been dated to 385 million years ago. To give you a frame of reference, the oldest dinosaur ever found is from 228 million years ago. The ancient forests didn't look much different than a modern forest. Scientists identified a species of tree known as Archaeopteris, with huge wooden roots and healthy green branches full of leaves. It reproduces by spreading spores, just like fungi. Modern trees release seeds that grow into other trees, but the ancient trees released spores, which were then carried by the wind. Researchers also identified ferns. So basically, the oldest known forest was a bunch of big trees and bushy ferns. Glorious Roman armor. You've seen it in movies and you've seen it on TV. Russell Crowe wore it in the movie Gladiator. There is nothing quite as awe-inspiring as Roman armor shining in the sun, clinging to the back of a legionnaire. But Roman armor isn't just lying around anymore. Finding real Roman armor is next to impossible. But the impossible was made possible in 2020. Archaeologists found the only surviving Iorica squamata armor ever at the site of Satala in Turkey. It's a unique piece of history and a priceless artifact. This is a real suit of armor that was worn by a Roman soldier in a legion almost 2,000 years ago. They call it scale armor because it looks like dragon scales. It was most popular with high-ranking officers during the 1st and 2nd century AD. The unearthed armor is in miraculous condition for its age. After removing a bit of mud, giving it a light washing, and doing a bit of restoration, the armor has been restored to almost perfect original form. I made it sound easy, but this was a tall order. Experts at the Erzurum Regional Restoration and Conservation Laboratory had to digitally remove the grime using X-ray and tomography scans. Then, each plate of armor was cataloged, conserved, and restored. One by one, the armor was stitched back together on a mannequin. After 3 long years of hard work, the armor is ready to be used in battle once again. Just imagine the looks on your neighbors' faces when you march out the front door dressed in real Roman armor. As cool as that would be, good luck getting your hands on this artifact. Historians have traced the armor to a soldier in the 15th Legion right before Rome fell. In 476 AD, the final Roman emperor was deposed. Romulus Augustulus was kicked off the throne by German chieftain Odoacer. Rome was defeated and would never recover. Although I've been calling it a suit of armor, what was found in Turkey is technically the segmented cuirass. It's the part that goes over the torso, constructed from horizontal metal bands attached with leather straps. The armor offered a great degree of protection from slashes to the chest, while allowing soldiers to move more freely.
Thanks for watching! Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed.
The ancient Birdman.
A pair of extremely unique burials have recently been discovered in Russia. One of the burials reveals what researchers have called the Birdman shaman. These burials belong to the Odinov culture of the early Bronze Age, and they were found in the Novosibirsk region at the ancient site of Ust-Tartus. Inside one of these graves, researchers were baffled to come across a collection of beaks and the skulls from birds, all of them assembled into something resembling either a headdress or some kind of piece of armor. Nothing like it has ever been found in Western Siberia, and the experts were left scratching their heads. Researcher Lilia Kobeleva from the Novosibirsk Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography believes the artifact was part of an article of clothing. Specifically, it was part of a ritual costume worn by a local shaman who collected the beaks and skulls of around 50 birds to decorate himself with. The birds were likely cranes or herons, and the ritual costume probably made the shaman look like a monster. The so-called Birdman lived 5,000 years ago and walked around with what was basically a cape made from bird beaks. Close to his burial was a double-layered grave containing 2 young children, and underneath them was the skeleton of a grown man. The whole thing is extremely confusing, and we don't know how the shaman relates to the children, or the man, or what exactly his purpose had been in their society. Namibian Shipwreck. A shipwreck has been discovered in Namibia, and experts believe it could very well be the lost vessel known as the Bom Jesus. It was discovered in a place once known as the Forbidden Territory. Deep in the Namibian desert, a German prospector found diamonds in 1908. The desert was soon totally overrun by Germans hunting for precious stones. They annexed the huge chunk of land for themselves, and they pillaged as many diamonds as they could before the World War. Back in 2008, somebody searching for leftover diamonds accidentally came across a shipwreck that hadn't been seen in over 500 years. The miners discovered scraps of metal, chunks of wood, and old pipes. They didn't even realize what they were digging up. Then they started coming across ancient muskets and elephant tusks, and that was when they realized it was a shipwreck. After they called in archaeologists to help with their excavation, they quickly realized it might be one of the most important shipwrecks ever discovered. The ship, which was buried underneath the sand, could be the Portuguese vessel the Bom Jesus, or the Good Jesus. It was on its way to India when something happened in the southern Atlantic Ocean and it was destroyed. It had been filled with thousands of pure gold coins from Spain and Portugal, and all that treasure was lost. It's likely that the ship broke apart after hitting a massive sandbar, and then slowly drifted onto the beach and was covered in sand. So far, the miners have allegedly uncovered roughly 44,000 pounds of copper ingots, along with a treasure chest full of gold and bits of tin and ivory. Terracotta deities. In Turkey, some extraordinary terracotta figurines have been discovered. These sculptures were found in such remarkable condition that they still have color on them, hints of blue and red from the pigments once used to decorate them, while the statues and carvings we typically see taken from archaeological sites are the boring color of sand. The truth is that most of them were actually quite colorful at the time of their creation. It's just that the pigment fades quickly, so thousands of years later, it's all gone. But here, in the ancient town of Mira, archaeologists have found over 50 terracotta figurines still painted. The team of researchers from Akdeniz University were excavating a Roman theater in the city, which was built about 2,000 years ago. They found the figurines buried underneath it. The figurines date to the days following Alexander the Great's death, between 323 BC and 31 BC. Perhaps most remarkable of all is that the statuettes, although they stand only a few inches tall, are almost like action figures. They depict everything from horses to warrior horsemen to ordinary Roman citizens, and then mythical figures like Apollo and Hercules. We're not exactly sure what these figurines were used for. Maybe they were a kind of collectible fad for kids to have their favorite heroes, or maybe they had more of a ritualistic value. All we know is that there are dozens of these things, little tiny effigies of all the most popular Greek and Roman gods. Rusty pirate sword. A rusty pirate sword has just been unearthed at a mysterious Christian monastery in northern Greece. It's a medieval saber, a sword with only one edge, and it had most likely been a deadly weapon wielded by a Turkish pirate. Either that, or the weapon had been wielded by the defenders of the monastery hundreds of years ago. Whatever the case, it's one of the strangest ancient weapons ever discovered. The main reason is that weapons made from iron very quickly deteriorate. Most swords and axes made as recently as the medieval times have already disintegrated into little more than crumbling rock. To find a sword in such great shape is absolutely remarkable. The weapon itself was actually quite popular, and if the iron didn't degrade so quickly, there would be hundreds of them found all over Europe. The single-edged saber was used by the Turks and the Byzantines during the 14th century. This was around the time that a brutal attack on the monastery where the sword was found was recorded in history. The monastery is dedicated to a local saint, Agios Nikolaos of Chrysokamaros. It's nothing but a ruin these days, about 40 miles southeast from the city of Thessaloniki, but had once been a kind of embassy church. It was a powerful establishment built in the 11th century. The monastery lasted 300 years and then fell into disrepair and was abandoned. The sword is most likely a leftover from the Turkish pirates who raided the place. The Narine Man. In 2005, contractors were digging in Narrabeen, a suburb of Sydney, Australia, for work on a bus shelter. They were clearing away dirt when they came across human remains. There was a literal skeleton staring them straight in the face, and so they called in forensic investigators. The workers didn't know what they were dealing with, if they had come upon a crime scene or what. And as it turned out, the skeleton was an ancient relic. Scientists dated the bones back 4,000 years. That makes the Narine Man, as he's since been named, the oldest human being found in Sydney. He is also the third oldest skeletal remain found anywhere in Australia. We know very little about this individual. He was roughly 30 to 40 years old when he died. He was buried on his side with one arm over his head in what may have been a ceremonial burial. He also had something sharp shoved into one of his vertebrae and some other wounds. Researchers believe he was probably speared to death, making him the first physical evidence of ritual murder in Australia. Viking Super spreaders. A team of scientists published a research paper back in 2020 about the origins of the variola virus, which you may know as smallpox. Now, the world was dealing with a different sickness then, and nobody paid too much attention to this vague study. But now it's time to look at what the researchers discovered, because it's actually quite fascinating. The team had managed to extract, for the first time, smallpox DNA from ancient skeletons. They were able to track its origins to Europe in 600 AD, but even more shocking was that the researchers were able to prove that the Vikings were behind the spread of smallpox and were the original super spreaders over 1,000 years ago. Basically, the Vikings were some of the first people to contract smallpox. They were also the ones who spread it across the globe. It's all thanks to them and their connections on the Silk Road. As you may know already, the Vikings traveled from Scandinavia to Canada, across the Mediterranean, down the rivers and into Russia and Ukraine, and pretty much everywhere except Asia. All this travel gave the Vikings access to complex trade networks. They were able to take things that they pillaged on their raids, stuff that they made themselves, and trade it along the Silk Road. It was really the beginning of globalization as we know it today, and it was a major help for spreading disease. Researchers found that smallpox really started to take off globally following the introduction of the Vikings to the trade network. It was because of them moving all over, going from one place to another, that smallpox was able to get around so easily and infect so many people. After the Vikings, globalization only became more powerful, and the spread of disease far easier. The Giant Tortoise. In Sicily, an international team of scientists discovered a burial site from the Bronze Age inside the Zubio di Cozza San Pietro cave. Within the burial site, the scientists found the bones of an ancient giant tortoise. The tortoise lived about 12,500 years ago, which is amazing for one main reason. This particular species of giant tortoise supposedly went extinct 195,000 years ago. Clearly, scientists had the date wrong by a huge margin. What this means is that giant tortoises lived in Europe for way longer than anyone had ever expected. The shocking discovery means that not only were giant tortoises living alongside modern humans, but people may have actually contributed to their collapse. Prehistoric humans may have hunted these animals to extinction. But what about the cave itself? It's a prehistoric burial ground where ancient human remains have been found. However, the dates of the human bones don't match up with the tortoise bones, so scientists are a bit confused why the remains are in the same place. As for how big the tortoise was, it was about 3 times larger than the Hermann's tortoise that still lives in Sicily today. Lost ancient treasure. In November of 2020, a man named Richard True was out waving his metal detector around near Llandovery in Wales when he came across an ancient treasure hoard. He discovered a giant spearhead, 3 small fragments of spears, almost a dozen axes, and a couple of sheets of bronze. All this stuff came from the Bronze Age and was buried together sometime around 1000 BC. That's about 3,000 years ago. When asked about the discovery, Richard said it felt as though he had been taken back in time. He just kept finding more and more objects, adding to the amazing collection. After Richard accumulated all the treasure he could, he got a hold of professional archaeologists with the National Museum in Wales, and they carried out an investigation of the area. They now believe all these bronze scraps had been placed inside a secret pit far away from any settlement, but it's still a mystery as to why. There are 2 main possibilities. Either somebody had stashed this bronze in a hole expecting to come back for it later, or it was part of a ceremony. Judging by the way the main spearhead was placed on the top of the hoard, the burial could have been part of a ritual. The spears and other treasures may have been part of a sacrifice to the Bronze Age community's ancient gods. Convict Artifacts. In Sydney, Australia, there is a neighborhood called The Rocks. It's the oldest neighborhood in the entire city, and so it's no surprise that it's rich with history. Archaeologists discovered remains in the neighborhood from the convict era. That's the time when Australia wasn't a country, but a British penal colony. The incredible artifacts from Australia's first shackled prisoners were found underneath a modern hostel. This is a posh new youth hostel where wealthy travelers stay while backpacking around the country. They are a far different sort of people than those who first lived in the Rocks. The hostel itself is built on stilts, and beneath the floorboards is evidence of Australia's first years. Excavations back in 1994 uncovered 2 full blocks from the 1700s. Archaeologists identified the remnants of 48 houses and shops that had all been occupied by either convicts or ex-convicts. That was almost 30 years ago, and now the area underneath the hostel is considered a historical treasure. Archaeologists didn't actually find chains and ankle restraints, nor the tattered rags of prison uniforms. What they found were the foundations of modern Australia, laid down between 1788 and 1868 by prisoners. In those 80 years, over 170,000 men and women were shipped by Britain to Australia, both to get rid of unwanted criminals and also to force them into starting a self-sufficient colony on the other side of the world. As brutal as it was, the end goal was a success. Caesar's assassination gold. The Eidmar coin is one of the rarest and most valuable ancient coins in the entire world. The coin was minted by a man named Marcus Junius Brutus. If the name sounds familiar, that's because Marcus Brutus was the one who betrayed Julius Caesar and was directly responsible for his death in the year 44 BC. The coin was minted by Marcus himself to commemorate the devastating assassination of the Roman Empire's first dictator and the lover of Cleopatra. For those unfamiliar with the story, Marcus Brutus led the group of Roman senators to Caesar on March 15th, known today as the Ides of March, and had him brutally murdered. Then he minted a coin with the words Eidmar stamped on it. The coin was so important that it remained in someone or other's possession throughout the centuries until it eventually wound up on display at the British Museum in London. It was there on loan from a private collector, someone we don't know. And just recently, the coin was sent to Zurich in Germany to be put up for auction, where it was expected to fetch a whopping $2 million. Thanks for watching! What would you do if you found a lost ancient treasure? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. See you soon! Bye!